And welcome to this episode of the Good Citizen Podcast. Today I want to dive into the topic of religious liberty as the cornerstone of a free society. Religious liberty as the cornerstone of a free society. Now, we talk about religious liberty all the time, but on this podcast, I enjoy going back to the basics and back to why is religious liberty so important as a believer, as a follower of Jesus, and why is it so critical? Why is it so fundamental to the rest of our beliefs? And religious liberty has been in the news for a number of years. Sometimes it is put in air quotes. Sometimes it is called just a cover for discrimination. And so I wanted to go below the surface just a little bit and double click on why religious liberty is so critical for us as believers, but also as the foundation of a free society. I want to talk a little bit then about where we are with religious freedom and then some ways that you can support and champion this important principle where God has placed you. Now, we've talked about a particular individual named John Leland before, but there's a particular part of his story that kind of jumped out at me recently, and so I wanted to start there. If you've studied American colonial history much, John Leland is probably somebody that you are familiar with, and if you're watching over on YouTube, I am going to share a PowerPoint, and so if you'd like to see some of the pictures and see some of the slides that I'll be working through today, you can hop on over to YouTube. But John Leland was an early leader in Virginia. He actually worked alongside James Madison and Thomas Jefferson to disestablish the church in Virginia. If you remember the story, there were a number of specifically Baptist pastors. I'm sure there were others as well, but primarily Baptist pastors that were jailed for not having a license to preach because they were not part of the actual established church. So he actually worked with them to disestablish the church. And then you move forward to the writing of the U.S. Constitution, and John Leland and James Madison lived in the same place. And so Madison was concerned, due to Leland's popularity, that he was not going to be elected to the ratification convention on the U.S. Constitution that he had helped draft. And so he met with Leland in this really important moment. And Leland said, hey, I will kind of withdraw from the race. I'll let you have the seat, but you have to promise something. You have to promise religious liberty. And so if you're grateful for the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, the right to the free exercise of religion, then you should thank a pastor, and specifically John Leland. But the story doesn't end there. Leland actually moved up to Massachusetts into the Northeast to work on disestablishing churches in that area of the country. And the latest state church that was disestablished was actually in the 1830s. And so this was an issue in early America. And he decided when Thomas Jefferson became president, remember they had this history, that he would put on quite a show. He put together something like a 1,300-pound wheel of cheese. It was actually 1,235 pounds, made only from cows of Federalist owners. So only Federalist cows. This is a now defunct party. But if you can imagine, only having cows that are from those that are Democrat or those that are Republican. And he hauled this thing all the way from Massachusetts to Washington, D.C. in the dead of winter. And in the crust of the cheese, he inscribed Jefferson's, my understanding, his favorite quote, which was, "Disobedience to tyrants is obedience to God." And as I enjoy saying, ladies and gentlemen, nothing says America like a tyrant-defying 1,300-pound wheel of cheese. And so he shows up in Washington, D.C., and they deliver it to President Jefferson, and the historical record reflects that he said, thanks? No, that's not in the record. But yeah, what do you do with a 1,300-pound wheel of cheese? I guess people around the White House had cheese for a while. But he delivered that to him, and what jumped out at me recently is that they delivered this cheese on January 1st of 1802. And there's this fantastic poem that goes along with the cheese called the Ode to the Mammoth Cheese. And there's a line, "Oh, may no traitor to his country's cause e'er have a bit of thee between his jaws." So it's this fantastic poem. And so here is Leland. He comes in, he delivers this cheese. And we know from history that just, I believe, 2 days later, Thomas Jefferson asked Pastor Leland to preach in the church that met in the chamber of the House of Representatives at the time. But so January 1st, 1802 is when this cheese was delivered. Now, you may remember a famous letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to a group of Baptists called the Danbury Baptist Association. Now, this letter is often misconstrued, and it is used to talk about separation of church and state as if it's, the church has no moral influence in government. That's certainly not true. It's actually a beautiful letter because it says to those that had been persecuted, hey, here in the United States, you will never have to worry about government interfering. So the question is, when did Thomas Jefferson write the letter to the Danbury Baptists? And again, if you're over on YouTube, you can actually see the actual letter here. So when did he write that letter to the Danbury Baptists? Remember, the cheese was delivered on January 1st, 1802? Well, that letter to the Danbury Baptists was written on January 1st of 1802. So on the same day that John Leland comes in with his massive wheel of cheese, here's a friend, or at least an acquaintance of Thomas Jefferson, a champion of religious liberty. What was on President Jefferson's mind when he wrote this letter? It had to be that he was going to see his friend John Leland, or he had already received the cheese. And so this, I think, is just an amazing story about relationships, about long-term investment in our governing officials, and actual influence through a pastor on James Madison and then Thomas Jefferson as well. And so I don't think Pastor Leland is talked about enough, and the incredible influence that he had on the founding of the United States and on religious liberty in general. Now, I wanted to jump just briefly into, well, where are we when it comes to religious freedom? I always talk a little bit about just kind of cultural developments, and I would say that religious liberty certainly has been on a string of wins at the United States Supreme Court, but it is certainly still under review, even under attack in our society. And something I would encourage you to take a look at is the Commission's report, the International Commission on religious liberty or religious freedom. And we've had several guests on that have talked about this commission on international religious freedom. It's something that I'm extremely proud of as an American. We've had on Ambassador Sam Brownback, who served in the first Trump administration, Laura Bryant Hanford, who had actually been a part of standing this up. And I wanted to just read to you a couple of opening lines from this year's report, and the whole report will be linked in the show notes. So here's just a couple of paragraphs as this report launches. The smell of ash lingers in the ruins of the Roman Catholic sanctuary, although it is far from Ash Wednesday. Yet sunbeams stream through the skylights above, rays of hope in the darkness. Nicaragua's Ortega Murillo regime has increasingly sought to stifle dissent. It has harassed, arrested, tried, and deported numerous members of the Catholic clergy, leaders of the country's largest religious community. It has used intimidation and manipulation to force into exiles leaders of the indigenous Moravian Church, including those who appear on the cover of this report. You can take a look at it. It has arrested members of the Mountain Gateway Ministry, including U.S. citizens, despite the community's historically positive relationship with the government. The regime has permitted violent attacks on houses of worship, including an arson attack that destroyed the 400-year-old crucifix inside the Chapel of the Blood of Christ in a major city depicted on the cover. Religious communities in Nicaragua have continued to show remarkable resilience in the face of such threats. Their members meet discreetly, sometimes in the middle of the night, to exercise their freedom of religion or belief. And I love this quote there in the opening pages of this year's report. Now more than ever, U.S. support for the right to freedom of religion or belief must remain a priority as both a strategic national interest and a reflection of our national identity. And certainly something that we are seeing around the world is this kind of renewed Cold War in the sense of maybe it's certainly not to the level of the 1980s with the Soviet Union, the 1960s, 70s, 80s with the Soviet Union, but these regimes like Russia, like China, that are suppressing belief, that are becoming increasingly militaristic and energetic and pushing their interests all around the world. And how would you highlight a difference between those efforts in the United States? Well, certainly promoting the freedom of religion would be one of them. And so this is, I think, a critical belief. Now, all right, what is it? So the first thing I wanted to talk about is, well, what is religious liberty? What is religious freedom? And so I wanted to double click on this just a little bit. And Pastor Leland, who wrote on religious liberty, he said this: government should protect every man in thinking and speaking freely, and see that one does not abuse another. The liberty I contend for is more than toleration. The very idea of toleration is despicable. It supposes that some have a preeminence above the rest to grant indulgence, whereas all should be equally free. Jews, Turks, or Muslims is what he was referring to, pagans, and Christians. So here's this Baptist pastor saying, look, religious liberty is something that should be granted to all people. So what exactly is religious liberty? I'll give you a definition. Religious freedom is the right to believe and live out one's deeply held convictions without fear of coercion or mistreatment by the government. The right to believe and live out one's deeply held convictions without fear of coercion or mistreatment by the government. The foundation of this belief is found in Genesis 1, 26 and 27. And it simply says that we are made in the image of God, male and female made he, them, and that we reflect God's image. And we've talked before about this just beautiful concept of that we're made in the image of God, we bear the image of God. And this led Paul Marshall, famous American, to say the right to follow our conscience lies at the center of human dignity and is the core of every other human right. And we've talked before about this image of God and how we talked about the Hubble Deep Field and how just this little point of light, as the Hubble Space Telescope peered at it, became not just a point of light, but thousands of galaxies. And you think about the vastness and mystery of space. And about all of that, the greatest understatement in the universe is God made the stars also, or he made the stars also. And so God was saying, I did all that, but the crown of my creation is humanity. It's you, it's me. And religious liberty recognizes this soul liberty, this unique value of the human soul. And also John 3:16, if you think about Christ, and here he is, he's God, and he could force conformity, but what did he say in John 3:16? For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him will have everlasting life, should not perish and have everlasting life. And so even as Christ is talking about the soul, as he's talking about eternal salvation, it is not something that is coerced. Salvation by definition cannot be coerced. And so the Christian belief is that we have soul liberty. We have the right of conscience to decide whether we will follow God or whether we will not. Now there can be consequences due to the created order because of that, due to the effects of sin, but that is the Christian belief. This also corresponds to a star. We've talked about this star-shaped public witness, that the sanctity of life, ethnic unity and justice, religious liberty for all people, the biblical sexual ethic, the Matthew 25 issues, they all come back to the fact that we're made in the image of God. And so Acts 17, 27 and 28 talks about how God, he has sought us. He has set out history in such a way that we would come to meet him. And then John 3:16 talks about how he does not force us. This verse is another verse that's important is Matthew 22:21, where Jesus says, "Render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's." So he's saying, to Caesar, you owe basic civil loyalty and respect, but to God, you owe ultimate allegiance and worship. And Caesar cannot step into that space. I mean, Caesar can even take someone's life, but they can't take your dignity. They can't take the fact that you still have an individual soul, and that God is the one that oversees that. And so religious liberty is something that has not been common throughout the ages. I'm sure as you look back through history, the American experiment is very unique in the sense that it separated deity and monarchy, and it gives us the opportunity to pursue our right of conscience and to freely exercise our faith without fear of government punishment. We've talked about before the denarius, I think this coin that Jesus was looking at, and on the front of the coin was the image of Caesar, on the back, Caesar's mother. And I think Jesus is emphasizing the different roles of church and state. So I don't have more time to go into that today because I want this to be pretty practical, but previously, we had on the podcast Andrew Walker talking about liberty for all, defending everyone's religious freedom in a pluralistic age. And so oftentimes I think Christians are looked at, oh, you're just trying to foist all of your beliefs on society. No, we believe that we're created in the image of God and that if we follow created order, we will all flourish well. But we're not here to use the levers of power to try to force someone into the following Jesus. It's impossible. That by definition can't happen. And so Christians should be the greatest advocates for religious liberty for all people. So there are a lot of different kind of definitions of religious freedom. I think most Christians say, I should follow this, I should support it, but it is so beautiful, it is so deep, and there's a lot of great history in the United States as we have practiced religious freedom, and now it is a part of our national identity. And so let's lean into that. This is a great good that we can bring to the world, especially in a time of rising technology, of new totalitarian states. This is something we need to lean into. And so that is what it is. Now, question of where is it? And last week we went through a number of different issues when talking about kind of Christian schools. And I covered a number of those. I want to just hit a few highlights here today. And as we've looked at kind of the jurisprudential bubbles, thinking of the marketplace, the school or independent board-run nonprofit, and then the church, that in the marketplace and even for the independent board-run nonprofit, there are challenges. The church remains the most protected, but there are still challenges there, as I'll mention, and how there have been cases that came after people like Jack Phillips, who served all people but just couldn't create all messages on his cakes. Places like the Fulton case or Catholic Charities in Philadelphia that just wanted to serve families and serve children according to their statement of faith and had to take that all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Something else is biblical counseling, the right of biblical counselors to be able to share what the Bible says about sex, about sexual identity, about gender identity, without fear of losing a license. Another issue would be John Klug, a school teacher, who just said, I'll use a child's last name, but I just can't use a preferred pronoun or a name different than their chosen, or a name different than their birth name. Just said, look, I want to use their last name. Can I just do that out of respect? And of course, that brought an adverse employment decision, and that case is still currently being litigated. Another challenge is certainly foster care. We've talked about a group called Sunrise before, a group in Kentucky that has been providing foster care, one of the largest providers, if not the largest provider in the state, has been doing that since just shortly after the Civil War. And the state came in and tried to force them to sign a statement that would have gone against their statement of faith. We've talked about parental rights, and just in the last week or so, many listeners are familiar with what happened in Colorado. And the Colorado House passed a bill saying that if you use a child's dead name or you don't provide gender-affirming care, you are engaging in, quote-unquote, coercive control, and that could be used to pull custody away from you. One of the encouraging developments, as we talked about on the podcast, though, is release time religious instruction, so that kids can be released from public school to a Bible study. If it's off campus, okayed by the parents, privately funded, and that's a major opportunity. One last issue, and I'm just kind of breezing through these today. One last issue that is coming up at the federal level is a bill that would say a tax exemption for churches should not and may not be considered federal financial assistance. And why is this important? Because with federal financial assistance, if you're a recipient of federal grants, you have to sign statements involving non-discrimination, often including sexual orientation and gender identity. And those statements are often construed as kind of an admission, well, you're not fully following your statement of faith. And most ministries, if they look at that, they would say, hey, I'm not going to sign that. In fact, I would rather not have the money so that I can practice and live out our beliefs without concern. But what this legal strategy or legal development would do is if you have tax exemption, and churches are automatically tax exempt generally, if you have tax exemption, you are a recipient of federal financial assistance because the way that these courts look at it is, well, you're getting a benefit. You're not having to pay taxes. Therefore, you're a recipient of federal financial assistance. That can be a hook for some of these non-discrimination requirements. And then, oh, look, you're preaching on this issue, or you fired an individual because they're not following your statement of faith, and now we're going to come after you. We're going to come after that tax-exempt status. So that's an important bill to watch at the federal level. Now, again, we breezed through those. Last week, if you want to hear more detail, just go back to last week's episode, and I walked through a lot of those areas in more detail. But then I wanted to close with, how can you, in your particular area, what's next for religious liberty? How can you impact this issue in your area? So I wanted to put out just kind of a strategy for defending religious freedom, one that I have basically followed, or Christians are basically following. That is engaging the church, then partnering with government, impacting elections, creating good public policy, and then defending religious liberty in court. And many Christians, I think we can get, because we've had a win streak at the Supreme Court, we can kind of sit back and say, hey, those Christian attorneys, they'll take care of this. Those public advocates, they'll take care of religious liberty. But as I often say, the best way to defend religious liberty is to use it. The best way to defend religious liberty is to use it. And so it takes Christians living all over this country, exercising their religious freedom every day, showing folks, hey, we come, we pray for you. I care for you as a public official. The church is a key partner with the state to make a difference. And then when some of these things come up, we're not looking at government with a side eye. We look at people that we know. We look at people that we've partnered with, and we're showing the good works. I love, as I work with government officials, bringing ministries that are doing amazing things in their community, showing the benefit of religious freedom. And so I wanted to just double click today. We talk a lot about religious liberty. We talk a lot about cases involving religious liberty. But I wanted to double click on why. Why is this so important? And it goes all the way back to the fact that we as human beings are made in the image of God, and that each person should be free to pursue truth. It should be able to pursue the right of conscience in the United States, and that everyone around the world, who is also, by the way, an image bearer, right? That they too should have this freedom. And we as Christians, because we know the gospel is the truth, we know that the gospel is the greatest story ever told, that we walk into the public square with confidence, knowing that this idea, the fact that Jesus got out of the grave, died for our sins, died on the cross, and rose again on the third day, as we celebrated yesterday, that idea wins in the end. And so my encouragement to you is just to think about religious freedom. How can I just do the work of the church? And that is going to be building out a public awareness of the benefit of religious freedom. And so here are some just thoughts. What is it? It's this idea that, hey, we should be free to live out our faith, to exercise our conscience without fear of punishment or mistreatment by the government. But that doesn't happen just in the courts. It doesn't happen just in the state houses or in the halls of Congress. It truly can happen in your own zip code as you champion this important right. And so religious liberty, I do believe, is the cornerstone of a free society. And so let's get out even this week and advocate for that in our area of influence. And then hopefully from here in the United States, we have the opportunity to impact places all around the world, places like Nicaragua, places like China and the Middle East, with this incredibly important principle, religious liberty. We'll talk with you next week.